How's everyone doing? Excellent. So my name is Roland Barcia. I'm the worldwide director in our worldwide specialist organization for app modernization, focus on things containers, serverless, Kubernetes, Lambda, integration, all the cool stuff with the new applications that people are writing. I'm joined by Rory and Andreas, they're going to introduce themselves when they come up. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit about modernizing security and GRC strategy. But before we get into that, I'm going to talk a little about some characteristics of modern applications. And so with that, let's get going. And so I just went through the agenda. I'm going to cover this first topic before I hand it over to Rory. And so with that, what do we mean by modernization? This word is very broad, has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit is give some context around modernization, give a little bit of examples, both from a developer, data scientist, data engineer perspective, and also then from an operational team and some of the things I spent time focusing on in my team. And so when we talk about modernization, we've probably heard things like the 7 R's, sometimes there's 8, depending on your cloud journey. I really want to get into the types of activities and the type of workloads that we're seeing when we build applications. And these are the 3 that we spend a lot of time with on the modernization team. So for example, replatform, working with a lot of customers that are taking workloads, dropping them into containers, using container orchestration technology to kind of move faster, to kind of build new applications, to kind of start their modernization journey. Then as lines of business want to get more and more agile and more use cases, they start to refactor maybe some of those applications into smaller units, microservices, so applications get smaller, different sizes. They start adapting different programming languages, different technology stacks. And then you're building new applications, and we get new patterns like eventual consistency, workloads, etc. And so these are just modernization patterns. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on that. But some of the drivers, I'll give an example around modernization, is customers want to get faster, and they want to build new applications faster. They want to get insight from the data faster. And so one of the drivers is I'm starting to adopt newer application patterns to move faster. And there's different techniques to do that. The other one is around better security and operational resilience. And so we're going to focus a lot, I think, on this factor today and modernizing that side of it, but really automating things like security checks, policy checks, automating things like performance and different sizes of compute, et cetera. And also modernization kind of helps reduce costs, and that's important as well. Moving to things like serverless, for example, where you can scale down to 0 when there's no events being emitted. Also, when you're kind of building containers, your applications get smaller, you have less of the operating system. So there's a lot of benefits, and these are some examples of some of the benefits that our customers are seeing. More recently, I think we've seen a lot of, with things like generative AI, ML technology, that modernization of applications give you better insight with data. This is an example. AdaptX automates a lot of their ETL processing. So how do I get insight from my transactions? How do I get data? And you can very quickly stitch together some integration technologies like EventBridge, Lambda, different storage technologies, different AI and ML technologies, and built out data pipelines to get a lot of insight from that data. And I think this is important to understand some of the factors. And so these are some characteristics of kind of modern applications. So there's 2 sides to things, and this is a slide that I show a lot because it's to the core of the philosophical battle that some of my teams and some of my customers deal with day in, day out, right? It's this tug of war between how do I give workload teams, developers autonomy? How do I give them freedom to go into the cloud and build a new application, but then how do I also have standards? And there's this kind of tension and this tug of war that we see from our customers around this space. So there's this tension, there's this tug of war between this, and we tend to go back and forth between the two. If you're over standardized, you can kind of build the system so brittle that you can't innovate fast enough because you have to go through a lot of manual checks and balances. I often find developers are like rivers, they're crooked. They find the path of least resistance, and they find their way around these kind of walls and these guidances and these security things. On the other end, on the autonomous end, you give freedom, you lose control, right? You can introduce security risks, security vulnerabilities, you can increase costs. Some developer spins up a container that scales to 1 million pods and eats up all your capacity. So what's the right balance? What are the right kind of bells and whistles? What are the right configurations? Automation solves a lot of these things, which Rory and Andreas are going to talk about, kind of modernizing some of that as well. But this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about kind of solving. And a little bit more on our operational model. So in AWS, there's often the joke that there's 17 ways to write a cloud native application, or 20 different ways to run a container. And so when we think about these things, there's a lot of best practices developers think about, like, hey, I'm doing something asynchronous, I'm doing event-driven architecture, I should use Lambda, I'm doing data processing, I should use AWS Batch, I can run that in a container. But the operational teams often have to get stuck supporting all of it. At the end of the day, they're trying to automate different types of patterns, and this is how we kind of achieve autonomy but also have some standardization, is if I kind of get ahead of these patterns. Now there's two extremes. A lot of our customers sit in between this, but we have customers that say, hey, I want to build autonomous teams. I want to kind of distribute development, distribute practices between those teams, and I want AWS to automate as many things as possible. And we call that serverless first, right? So if you ask someone from Amazon 5 years ago, serverless was synonymous with Lambda. And Lambda meant I build a lot of functions. I think we've evolved our thinking to really think about serverless as an operational model where you provide a cloud, an environment that a developer or a data scientist builds their piece of code, their Jupyter notebook, or a database table, and they just deploy it, and we give it some configuration parameters around the workloads, and AWS will then scale it for you, secure it for you, and do these things for you, right? So serverless is really about that operational model. It simplifies versionless. I'll talk about that in a minute. Low infrastructure management, so you're really just surfacing the capabilities of the cloud. Now, AWS is a platform with choice. We have another set of customers that are really keen on, hey, I want to bring my own stack, and specifically Kubernetes is something that we're dealing with a lot of our customers, and EKS being really one of the best places in cloud to run Kubernetes. We're seeing lots of traction with that. And what we're seeing is the customers that are successful bringing Kubernetes into AWS are doing what's called platform engineering, right? So they're building out teams that really are good at doing things like upgrading clusters. There's sometimes automation around things like deploying workloads to different clouds that have Kubernetes, or on-prem and cloud. They're in the middle of their journey from on-prem to the cloud. And so they choose a technology like Kubernetes, and they use the ecosystem around the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF, to build those technologies, and they integrate with AWS services. And so really, Kubernetes has a lot of traction with some of our customers. And some people view Kubernetes as just a compute model, and they integrate it and use serverless technology together with Kubernetes. Some of our customers have adopted Kubernetes more broadly as a deployment API. And so they're using tools like Argo CD and Flux to do GitOps. They're using technologies like our AWS controllers to create native AWS resources from a Kubernetes API using some of those ecosystem tools. So the surface increases. I just had a discussion with a customer yesterday that is actually deploying all of these technologies because as they've grown through acquisition, they have different departments, right? They have some of their departments that have gone in and built Kubernetes-based applications. And have another department that's using Lambda and Fargate with serverless containers. And now they're like, how do I standardize across the two? And they use different technologies. And so the reason I bring this up, because it has an effect on your automation strategy around security, et cetera, with that compliance, governance, and risk. And so with that, let's talk a little bit more and get to the kind of GRC part of the presentation. Modern computing is happening, and you have to worry about it from a security perspective. You have to worry about it from a compliance and risk perspective. Just to give you some stats, like 80% of all containerized applications run in AWS. From a security perspective, I really like to think about, we have over 100K customers running ECS containers. We have billions of compute hours on EKS, 10 times usage growth year over year. So more and more containers are being thrown into the system. Talking about Lambda, over a trillion requests. This number has kind of grown of Lambda executions per month, hundreds of thousands of customers. We have quadrillion observations monitored. So as you're building these applications, you have observability patterns, you have observability standards, and so you're seeing all these messages around. So this is another surface area. And then another statistic, building containerized applications, you have a container registry. We have ECR, the Elastic Container Registry, within our environment. We have 13 billion pulls images per week. So these are just container images that are being pulled whenever a container spins up, either an ECS task or an EKS pod. And these technologies are really pervasive. And Gartner estimates that 90% of global organizations will have production applications running by 2026, so 90% of them. So containers is there, serverless is there. We have all these technologies, this kind of surface area. So what do? Well, one of the things to keep in mind is, this tug of war that I talked about. When we're talking about modern apps, applications are getting smaller, teams are getting more distributed. And so with smaller apps helps you move faster, individual pipelines, individual life cycles, but at the same time, it's harder to observe lots of different things going on in the system. And so the attack surface increases. And so, for example, when we're talking about containers, this is kind of a chart. There's actually a workshop in the other building at 140 or 130 where they're doing a hands-on example of doing GRC in practice, right? Defense in depth. So when we're talking about containers, you're really talking about my data, my configuration, my source code, my images, my dependencies, and you're doing this more full-blown across the board. I'm not going to go into detail here. So this is kind of an example of all the different areas that you need to think about. Talk about Kubernetes clusters, you introduce open source technology, open source risks that you need to think about. And so when we're talking about modern apps and security, there's best practices, absolutely. The question is, can you enforce those best practices? Can you automate those best practices? Can you keep those best practices consistent across our organization? We have multi-account architectures, least privilege, data in rest or in transit, security at all layers, centralized logging. All these things are best practices, but it's easier said than done sometimes, right? And this is where GRC is really important. And so with that, wanted to kind of give this context around modernization because this is key. And so, this was kind of weird for me having to hold two things at once. So hopefully it wasn't too awkward, but I'd like to introduce Rory, who's going to come up and kind of take us to the next level here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. So my name is Rory Richardson. I'm a director of Cloud Foundational Services, which is all the services that you absolutely have to get right in the cloud or you might fail. And it sounds really threatening, but it's also incredibly accurate. So I run the go-to-market teams around security, cloud operations, resiliency, and the builder experience. And it may sound like a hodgepodge, but there's a reason why all of these things are coming together. And we're get into that a little bit later in the presentation. There's also a reason that I am in between the fabulous Roland and the fabulous Andres. And that is because I have a foot in both worlds. Prior to taking on this team, I ran the serverless go-to-market team. And I was in that period from like 5 years ago to 2 years ago where the world was in transition from thinking beyond just Lambda as serverless, but how do I build an entirely serverless stack? With the simple idea of, why do I need to manage my infrastructure anymore? That's so 2001. So now, when we have these conversations about modernization or serverless, I have increasingly found that the conversations weren't about Lambda at all. Lambda worked. What were your questions about Lambda? We don't care. It's fine. Well, Lambda works. The questions that we have about how to build an entirely serverless architecture were around GRC. I was spending all my time on Lambda having conversations about this is how you conduct a security review in an entirely serverless environment. How do I set up operations when I'm no longer managing servers? And then how do I answer questions about compliance when the compliance standards haven't even caught up to the cloud? GRC is a structured way to align IT to the business goals while managing the risk and meeting all the industry and government regulations. This includes the tools and processes in order to reduce uncertainty and meet compliance requirements, not recommendations, they're kind of requirements. Some common challenges when I was talking to customers is lack of visibility. I don't know about you, but raise your hand if you have a serverless environment today or a modern environment. Man, one of the things that is most challenging for customers is figuring out what the heck is going on. We have found that customers that are deploying in this modern architecture are doing a lot more with monitoring and observability because there's a lot more going on. Moving to a service-oriented architecture or microservice architecture, or whatever you want to call it, introduces a different level of complexity in how the information is flowing in a way that you just don't need to have that level of visibility to when you're dealing with monolithic applications. Data security is also a huge concern because back in the day, we only had the choice of Oracle, SQL, maybe some mumps if you were really out there. There just wasn't a whole lot of diversity in your relational database choices. And now you get to choose the right database for the job, but it also introduces complexity of how you are managing security within those data structures. Regulatory compliance is also something that we're constantly chasing our tail on. How do we create the compliance standards that are making our customers safe? And then how do we prove that we've actually met those compliance standards? Then there's the third-party risk. How many of you have a third party in your environment? And how do you know that how they have built their solution is compliant with your standards? Do you have a common audit mechanism in order to make sure that it's true? But the biggest thing, the absolute biggest thing, the master we are all serving, or all the North Star we're all chasing, is how do we keep up with the pace of innovation? The world keeps changing on us. And how do we keep up? So I wanted to share a story because I love stories. And I've been with Amazon over 10 years. I kind of feel like the great grandma of cloud computing at this point because, man, have I seen a lot of changes. So when I was working on serverless, there was a bank who was interested in moving to the cloud. And they presented here at Inforce last year primarily about threat detection. It was the Bank of Montreal, and it's one of the largest banks in North America, and they were almost entirely on-prem. Now think about financial institutions. They're not usually at the cutting edge of technology innovation, right? They're usually having to deal with compliance standards that exceed the pale, right? So they were moving a little slow. And they came to AWS and said, how do we transform our organization? Because we got to move faster. The world is changing, and we're not going to be able to keep up if we are constantly tied to these monolithic applications, centralized databases, and, I dare I say, mainframes. And I was like, all right, where are we going to start? The interesting thing about their transformation was they didn't start with technology. They started with their customer problem. And their customer problem was that they needed to move faster, and they needed to future-proof their organization. The very next thing they did is they started with culture. How do we turn security from the department of no into the department of maybe? How do we make security so embedded in everything that we do so that we can move faster and we're not waiting on the hallowed halls of security to okay an application after it's already built? So we worked on culture a lot. We talked about how to create innovation. We also worked on even their organizational structure, because their organizational structure had to move with their technology. They created a lot of different roles. They enabled T&C, training and certification, because they realized they had to start with their people first. The technology would come second. You can look up BMO, they're all in on AWS, and they have a serverless first strategy in order to meet the challenges that they felt they were going to be facing over the next 10 to 50 years. And so I think it's super interesting that in order to move fast, they moved slow. They started with culture, and they also started with setting up a framework for how they were going to think about security and operations from the get-go before they did the things that are, dare I say it, more sexy, like Lambda and containerization. They started with the foundational elements first. So let's take a second to talk about the evolution of software development. Because in the beginning, there were developers, and we saw that it was good. Except we evolved past that. Around 2007, we started thinking, well, maybe if we created smaller teams and combined development and operations, maybe we could move faster. Because we found that when developers wore pagers, we got better code. And so instead of worrying about operations being holding us back, if we combine forces, maybe we'll get some operational efficiency. And turns out it worked. DevOps became increasingly popular. Again, so with service-oriented architecture and microservices. So that part was great. Awesome. And we also improved operations significantly, such as creating environments where we weren't necessarily monitoring how we're deploying patches at the hypervisor. What if we took care of that for you? So if we could lessen the load of operations on our DevOps team, maybe we could move even faster. Great. So we are taking on a lot of operational burden for our customers so that our DevOps teams are moving faster. And now we get to another stage because the world is constantly changing. And that is the introduction of DevSecOps. DevSecOps is super interesting because it truly democratizes the role of security within an organization. So no longer is it in the hallowed halls of the CISO and the security experts, but now we're going to shift left. Now we're going to make it everybody's problem. The problem with this, and if you follow Ben Kehoe on Twitter, which I strongly recommend because he's always has something interesting to say, he is of the opinion that if we're shifting left and DevSecOps is not making developers security experts. I totally agree with that because I can tell you it would take me 10, 20 years to be a security expert. But yet we're asking developers who aren't to be the first line of defense and security. So we got to give them some more tools. And just like with operations, we got to think about it from a managed standpoint. So the other great trend that is happening within the evolution of software development is Gen AI. If we're able to help folks do pattern recognition within their environment and run those security checks at the point of the inception of the code, we're going to be able to move faster. That doesn't mean that you don't need security experts within your organization. What it is this democratization of security to be everybody's job and to run those security checks earlier on in the cycle. There's a few things that we're doing in order to help customers and your organizations and, well, everybody to shift left. And by shift left, I'm particularly talking about how we're moving security and governance and control to early on in the development cycle. You've heard from CJ in the keynote that we've just released Code Whisperer. Have anybody played with Code Whisperer yet? It's kind of neato, because especially if you're not a syntax person, because it will suggest different code samples based on natural language comments. You're going to be able to code faster. Are you going to make the most elegant, gorgeous code that has ever been written? No, because it's doing pattern recognition from existing code samples, right? But it's going to allow you to move faster. Additionally, we've incorporated security scans so that in the free version of Code Whisperer, you have an option of 50 security scans, because security is job zero. Great, now we can run security scans as we're writing code. But we're not stopping there. The advancements that we're making in Code Catalyst, DevOps Guru, I don't have this on there, but even Code Guru, are all following the same path of how are we incorporating generative AI in order to help shift left so that we can do more with less. I'm not going to lie. We are in an economic situation where doing more with less is the world that we live in. So how can we operationalize that to go even faster? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andres. Like I said, I got foot in both worlds. I was previously on serverless, but now I'm fastly heading towards GRC. And I'm super proud of the work that we're doing to help enable you guys to innovate faster. Andres?
Thank you. I'll take that. You can keep that one.
Okay.
Apologies. Anyway, my name is Andres Silva. Don't worry, you don't have to say it like that. I am manager for the Cloud Operations Specialist SA team. So I lead all the specialist SAs for Cloud Operations, which includes the observability side of the house with CloudWatch, X-Ray, and all the open source set of products that we have. The compliance use case, which includes AWS config, CloudTrail, and also the governance side of the house with Control Tower organizations. And I'll speak about some of those as we talk a little bit about best practices. I've been at AWS for about 8 years. I started in the support organization, and it was actually quite cool to work as a technical account manager for some of our largest customers. And the one thing that I enjoyed about that job is that you're in the trenches with customers, solving real problems. You're not just, talking about potential things you could do, but actually solving real problems, and you learn a lot. So some of the things that I'm going to share with you are learnings from a lot of those customer interactions that I had in the past, some more recent interactions that I had in my current role as a specialist SA. And I'm so happy that you got to hear from Rory and Roland. They're great leaders in our organization that are very well positioned to talk about the things they did. And I think they painted a very good picture of how important GRC is for modern applications. So I'm going to go over a few of what I'm calling best practices that are tied to some common misconceptions, and I'll explain that, right? So let's start with compliance, right? And everybody's going to face compliance at some point as they migrate workloads, develop new applications in the cloud. Compliance is going to come up. It's important. So you have to think about it. Now, one common misconception is that, well, I'm using a managed platform. I'm using AWS, so I don't have to do anything, right? I just spin up stuff and I'm compliant. And, the reason I say that in a like a joke is because I lived it, right? I lived it as when I was a customer and worked in implementing a platform and learned the hard way that it's not like that. That is, as you can see there on that slide, a myth. Let's talk about why and what do you need to know. You have to know your compliance in the cloud. Like you see in there, know the rules, right? What do I mean by that? When you talk about compliance, and when I talk about compliance, I mean meeting the requirements of a specific compliance framework, be it PCI, HIPAA, whatever it is, when you're running workloads in the cloud, in AWS. It's not just AWS's problem. It's a shared responsibility, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in the next slide. But what I mean and what I want to emphasize as a best practice is that you have to invest time and resources in understanding how it works, in understanding what is your responsibility as a customer, what is the responsibility of AWS as the cloud provider, what things you need to worry about, what things you don't need to worry about. There are different requirements for different compliance frameworks. For example, if you're trying to comply with HIPAA, there is this thing called the BAA, Business Associate Agreement, that you have to be familiar with, and you have to go in and adopt it. Now, how many people here know what AWS Artifact is? Excellent, that's great. That is an important tool to know if you want to know the rules. That is where you are going to find all the documentation that you need to prove to your auditors that the part that we are responsible for is taken care of, has been validated, has been verified. The other important thing is to understand the shared responsibility model. Now, how many of you have seen this slide in any AWS presentation before, right? A lot of you, right? But I put it again because it is super important that we talk about the difference between security in the cloud and security of the cloud. That means the things you are responsible for and the things that we are responsible for, right? So the fact that I sell you a car with a lock doesn't mean that if you leave it unlocked and with the keys in, somebody couldn't steal it, right? You're supposed to lock it and take the keys with you. So it's an analogy of how things work. There are things that you are responsible for and things that we are responsible for. And in order to be effective in implementing GRC in modern applications, you have to invest time in knowing these things and understanding them. So that's super important. Another important thing is that when you define controls, either be for security, either be for whatever reason that you need to either comply or because you're implementing security, you're implementing governance, you can do this in one of two ways. You can do it proactively and you can do it reactively. So reactively means that you have implemented mechanisms that if something that is not desired occurs, you can detect it and then you can take action and do it. But I think we have to change the mindset because we have a lot of tools that do that, but we have to change the mindset and say, okay, how can I do it in a proactive way so it doesn't even happen in the first place, right? And that takes a lot. There's a lot of things that you need to do in order to implement that. It takes training people. Rory just talked about moving security to developers, DevSecOps, right? That's part of it, right? How do you implement processes? How do you train people so that they are more proactive than reactive as you implement it, or as you implement your strategy? So for that, a lot of people don't know that we offer many tools and services that allow you to define controls, implement security in a proactive way. The first thing you see there is Control Tower, right? Many of you are familiar with it. It's a very easy way to get started. Now, how many of you knew that Control Tower provides a mechanism to implement proactive compliance? How many of you knew that? Very few, right? So yeah, Control Tower, if you want to get started in a very easy way and you want to implement a number of proactive controls to meet regulatory compliance requirements or for security reasons, you can use it. It's a very easy way of getting started, right? Get it going. It's the easy button, right? But we also have a lot of controls, a lot of powerful tools within AWS organizations. AWS organizations allows you to structure your accounts, implement security around them, and implement what we call service control policies that define who can do what at what level. So that is a very powerful and effective way of also implementing proactive compliance. I already talked about Control Tower, and Control Tower works in proactive mode, and it leverages AWS config to also do detective. So the goal is to try to do as much as you can in a proactive way, and then if you can't do something in a proactive way, then implement security or controls using AWS config. So you want to try to implement as much as you can proactively, and then what you can't do proactively, leverage things like AWS config and other tools that we have to detect and react to any potential security issues or any non-compliant violations that you may have in your environment. All right, let's talk about something else, automation. So one common challenge that we hear from customers is that the scale, the velocity of cloud resources it's daunting. It can be overwhelming. It is impossible to try to use the old mechanisms to track security, compliance, maybe keeping things on an Excel spreadsheet, right? Or having an inventory of your servers. That doesn't work anymore, right? Especially when you talk about modern applications, EKS, Lambda. You have so many iterations of resources that live and die very, very quickly. So you have to, when you define a control, you have to implement it in a way that is automated to track any potential issues. Now, how can you do that? Well, leverage CI/CD to review and enforce preventive compliance. That's one way that a lot of our customers implement preventive or proactive, that should say proactive, that's a typo, proactive compliance. But what I mean is there's so many mechanisms. If you enforce a CI/CD pipeline to deploy code, if you are developing an applications, many of our customers are using AWS to run applications that are already being developed. But that doesn't mean that you can't implement CI/CD to deploy the resources and maintain the resources. So the same principles apply. And in that pipeline, you can implement automated controls to prevent things from happening, to detect things that are non-compliant, non-secure. Definitely want to do that. For that, we have a couple of services that can be of great help. So we have AWS Config. How many of you are familiar with AWS Config? A lot of you, right? Now, did you know that AWS Config allows you to implement proactive controls even before deploying a resource? How many of you knew that? Not many of you, right? Yes, you could do that. You can take AWS Config, it's a special API that we provide in it, that allows you to implement that as a step in your CI/CD pipeline that calls the AWS Config API, and you provide the resource that you're about to create, and it validates if based on the rules that you have deployed, will this be a compliant or non-compliant resource? That's a very powerful way of even preventing things from being deployed, being created in a non-desired state. So, of course, you can also with AWS Config implement detective controls. And speaking about automation, another powerful thing that you can integrate with AWS Config is the remediation of resources that are non-compliant. So if something was created, let's say a resource with no tagging, as an example, or a security group that doesn't have the right settings, you can leverage AWS Systems Manager to correct that in an automated way. This is super important because if you have a task that is creating hundreds and hundreds of resources at any given point, you want to be able to detect and react immediately. And the combination of those two services can help you with that, definitely. So that's super important. Automation, automation, automation. And as part of our efforts for automation and to encourage our customers to continue using tools like AWS Config, we continue innovating. And I've been given the great privilege to let you know that we have just released a new feature for AWS Config. It's called resource exclusion by type. So what does this do? Well, traditionally AWS Config, when you turn it on, you track everything, all the resources. And if you wanted to exclude something traditionally, you had to explicitly remove it from the list. You have to explicitly manage the list, I take that back, sorry, and say, these are the only ones that I want to track. Resource exclusion by type, what it allows you to do is allows you to select a setting, either via the console or the API, that says, I want to track everything but this one. And that is super helpful for customers that may want to avoid using or tracking a specific resource. Important in ephemeral workloads like containers, where so many things are being created and destroyed. You're more interested in the definition of that task, of that service, and not necessarily the instantiation of that resource. So that allows you to do that in a very effective way. So that's a very cool way that you can continue doing automation as you implement governance, risk, and compliance. Let's talk about another thing. Security everywhere. And I'm not going to spend too much time here because Rory did an amazing job in explaining how important that is, that we move or shift left the security all the way and bringing it to developers to a reasonable degree, right? Like she stated, because it's impossible to have developers become security experts. But this is super important. And another thing that is key when you're implementing GRC for modern applications. And what that means is that you implement security testing, or even better, like I said, DevSecOps in your organization. Security should be part of every step of the process. And here are some tools. Some of them, I think Rory mentioned. I think I need to add to this list Code Whisperer, super important if you're trying to do this. But Code Catalyst is another product that we released at last reInvent that I encourage you to take a look at, and it will greatly help you with that. How many of you know what chaos engineering is? Right? Chaos engineering is another powerful way to validate that the security controls that you're implementing are actually working. It also, of course, helps with fault tolerance, right? To make sure that your applications are really resilient. But we have a product called AWS Fault Injection Simulator that could be a great help in doing that also. All right, let's talk about something else. My cat. No, I'm just kidding. Privilege creep. How many of you ever heard that expression or that, right? This is so interesting. What do we mean by privilege creep if you never heard about it? Is that thing that happens, and I know all of you have run into this if you're managing any kind of infrastructure, that you start working on a feature or an application and you constantly getting requests. Oh, I need this permission. Oh, I need this permission, this permission, this permission, right? And after a few months, that one role or that one developer ends up having this mountain of privileges that are not desired, right? That's what we call privilege creep, right? And it's lurking, as you can see with the cat, right? So what does that mean, and what's the important thing here? It means that least privilege needs to be least privilege all the time. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to implement least privilege, and I'm done, right? Because permission or privilege creep will come back and get you, right? So how do you do it? Well, you have to understand how, in AWS terms, IAM works. It's super important. You need to understand how it works, what permissions an individual or a role uses, and then provide those permissions preferably based on API usage, right? There are tools that we have. You can either use CloudTrail, but we have IAM Access Analyzer too that allows you to see exactly what permissions, or to model what permissions an individual would need to do a specific task. And then you can just go and create only those permissions. Okay, great. I've created the permissions that I want, but they're going to ask me for more permissions. How do I continue to make sure that it's all the time? You need to audit. You need to continuously audit and remove unnecessary permissions. Every so often, you have to audit all your permissions. You have to work with the teams to baseline their permissions and make sure that that's exactly what they need. Consider permission boundaries. Consider resource tags for permissions. That's another powerful way of implementing least privilege. If you're not familiar with ABAC or access-based attribute, I got it messed up. You know what I'm talking about, right? Based on the tag, you implement the policy that will provide the permissions. That's another way. And establish a user lifecycle policy for your organization. Here are some of the tools that can help with that. IAM, IAM is super powerful. IAM can implement security based on tags, with exceptions, based on region, based on IP address. There's so many things you can do with IAM, super powerful to implement least privilege. IAM Identity Center, it's also super helpful because it allows you to centralize the access of your users. Firewall Manager is another great product that you can use to implement least privilege all the time. But the important thing here is audit, 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 right? all the time. And speaking about auditing, we always want to know who, what, where, when, and why, and how also. What do I mean by this? The importance of auditing and monitoring activity in your environment, right? This is super important when you implement GRC for modern applications. But you need to be careful because you need to do it in an efficient way. I remember many years ago working on a project where we started using a centralized logging solution because we wanted to monitor everything was being done. And we were just in the first stages of development of the application. So it was a lot of development happening, a lot of new things changing. And we encourage all the developers to send their logs to the centralized solution. And what ended up happening is that they sent too much. So before we know it, we had terabytes and terabytes of data. So we need to be efficient in the way we do this. But we need to be able to audit and get the details of what happened at any given point for security reasons. So you want to leverage monitoring and logging tools to track access and activity in your applications and infrastructure. How many of you know what CloudTrail is? Everybody, right? Who doesn't know CloudTrail? Now, how many of you know what CloudTrail Lake is? Less, right? Well, I'll explain it to you. CloudTrail, as you know, is our managed platform for auditing. So everything that happens in AWS, any API that's called, any console login, it gets logged, it gets tracked. Every so often, we take all those, we put it in a JSON file, we zip it for you, and we put it in an S3 bucket. That's CloudTrail, right? There's a component of what I'm going to call CloudTrail Classic that allow you to do some limited searches on the console, right? But what happened is we heard a lot of feedback from customers saying, hey, you know, I would like to have a more powerful way of doing searches in the console, in a graphical environment. And that's what CloudTrail Lake is. CloudTrail Lake allows you to quickly query all that data that you have there in very, very powerful ways for as long as you want to keep it there for. The way it works is that the pricing is done at ingestion and includes 7 years of storage. And then the only other pricing component is the amount of data scanned in a query. It's super efficient and very, very cost efficient too, based on the fact that we include 7 years of storage on it. It supports CloudTrail data, but it also supports data from AWS config. So that means you can actually do queries that join both sets of data. So if you're trying to investigate a change in config, you can get more detailed data about who was the individual that did the change, what time did it happen, what was the API call, and things like that. Lake also works with Audit Manager data, and it's a super powerful way of monitoring access and activity. There are other tools that you can use for that, like Access Analyzer, and of course, CloudWatch logs. A lot of our customers leverage that. It's interesting that you can actually take traditional CloudTrail data and send it to CloudWatch logs to do more powerful analysis, like filter for a specific event and create a metric based on it. And then you can do anomaly detection on that metric with our AI-powered features in CloudWatch. So that takes it to the next level, right? Because if you are in the middle of an incident, the data that you can have access to based on those components can be super powerful and can make a big difference. So cool, I've been given another privilege to announce that just today, we released a new feature of CloudTrail Lake called CloudTrail Lake Dashboards. And what this does, this is actually pretty cool because before the session, I went and enabled it on my AWS account, and I immediately started seeing things that I didn't know were happening. So like some bucket was, something was writing data to one of my buckets and I didn't even know. So what it is that we have created a set of predefined dashboards that we'll include in the console. You do have to opt in, right? You have to say, okay, I want it. And after you do that, we start collecting the data and we'll go ahead and create those dashboards for you. And it gives you right there in the first page, super powerful information about what's going on in your environment with these dashboards. And that data is coming from CloudTrail Lake. So this is a super cool feature. I would encourage you to take a look at it. And it's definitely another big help to cover that task of audit and monitoring your environments. Let's talk about another thing. Here's something that you hear sometimes, right? Cloud is bad for data privacy. I want to keep it on my data center because I can lock it in there, right? Well, data privacy is super important in the cloud. And I think if we are serious about security, governance, we need to understand how data privacy and data security work in the cloud. There's a number of tools that we have for that can help you. Of course, you can implement proactive and detective controls using the AWS config. But there's super powerful tools like Macy that you can use. You can use KMS to encrypt your data. So it's important to understand that these options are available for you and to leverage them as you implement and design your infrastructure. Data privacy, again, is super important. They have an icon there of Incident Manager also, and you may be wondering, well, what does that have to do with data privacy? Well, there's a lot of interesting things you can do combining these products, right? Like, you can have a detective control that is looking at the possibility that data might have been exposed. That detective control can trigger in AWS config a rule that flags it, but that same rule can connect to incident management or incident response platforms. AWS has, as part of Systems Manager, an incident management platform that can immediately notify whoever you configure, set up the escalation, run playbooks to address the incident, and that can greatly reduce the time that will take to mitigate any risk that the data might have been exposed to. So if you're interested in data security, I know we all are, just make sure you take a look at these products and some of these recommendations that I've placed here. So those are some of the things that I wanted to share with you in terms of best practices, things you can do. There's a lot of our customers that have implemented some of these, and we learn from them. I want to share briefly with you a success story about this. Is our customer Siemens. There's a very nice case study in our website about what they did, but they use a couple of the services that I mentioned before, like Guard Duty, Security Hub, Config, and Organizations, to address some of the challenges that they had in terms of managing AWS infrastructure. They use Guard Duty to detect malicious activity, and those findings are delivered to Security Hub, so that gives them a centralized place for them to keep track of everything that's happening. Of course, that in the background is using AWS config. They implemented proactive compliance with AWS organizations. They're leveraging Inspector and many other things. And I love the quote from Scott over there. Pulling data individually from each source and doing our own correlations was difficult. Migrating to AWS Security Hub and Amazon Guard Duty gave us a central view into the data, which was very desirable. So this is just one example. We have many other customers that have been successful doing this, and you can be successful too. But you may be wondering at this point now, how do I get started with all this? I have some resources to share for you. Feel free to take a picture of the following QR codes. But this is a QR code that will help you. There's a page that we have that has some guidance on how to design and implement a multi-account strategy. That is super important. Many of our customers, that's one of the first questions that we get asked. You're going to end up with multiple accounts. What is the best strategy to do that? There's some good resources there. Consider using Control Tower. Reach out to your account team. They can help. They can engage us if needed, and we can come have a conversation with you. More than happy to do that. We have training courses that are specific on GRC. Take advantage of those. And a lot of partners that are willing to help if you need their help. Here are some other QR codes that I want to share with you. The first one is GRC in the cloud, good summary of what it means. The second one is training from our training and certification team. They have put out some awesome training on this topic. And the third one is a page that aggregates partner solutions to address GRC. So please do take advantage of those. All right, so thank you very much. That's all I have for you. We're about up on time, so I'm going to be around here. If you have any questions, you want to chat with us, be more than happy to do that. But thank you for coming. Really appreciate it. And thank you again.